Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 71. Before we get into today's questions, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. And if you listened to Monday's episode, you heard founder Andy Blow talk about the latest in hydration and nutrition research and practice. And that was a great one. So if you missed it, make sure you go back and listen to that one. And it also is a great introduction to Precision Hydration as a company. They do so much more than just manufacture electrolyte products, but they act like hydration consultants and bringing the best and most reliable information to the masses, as you could hear in that interview with Andy Blow. You can get 15% off your order with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15. And again, the website is precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka. And here we have an announcement, a new code or a new way to use the 20% discount that we've had for a long time. But since the code tends to be spread on the interwebs on various dubious coupon code websites, we have a new system to prevent that, which is a designated landing page that you can go through to get your 20% discount code. This landing page is roka.com/TTS, and that will prevent people that are not really listeners of the podcast from using the podcast listeners coupon. So roka.com/TTS to get 20% off your order of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses. Sorry for the quite a few recent changes in the codes and the system we've had, but I think that with this setup that we have, with this designated landing page, we will be able to keep that going for a long time now with the same sort of system. And before we get into today's questions, one house cleaning item. I am back in Portugal recording now after spending 3 months in Finland while my apartment was being renovated. And you can probably hear a bit of an echo in this episode. I am recording in a very empty, clean but empty space at the moment. So there's really nothing to absorb the sound. So it's probably going to be a bit more echoey than usual. And hopefully with time, I'll be able to get the podcast set up in a way that reduces the echo. But apologies for this episode in advance if you find that it's a bit more echoey than usual. But let's get into today's questions, which all have something to do with double workouts in one way or another. So that's a bit of a theme. And the first question here comes from Guy, who writes, "Hi, Michael. Thank you for continuing to produce excellent content. I have a quick question about fitting short, fast swim intervals into my training. I am moving up from 7.3 to full Ironman this season. A typical training week consists of 4 bike rides, 5 runs, 1 main strength session, and 2 swims. The first swim is with a group on Monday mornings, typically a bit over 3 kilometers, and it's always threshold and endurance work, lots of intervals between 200 to 400 meters. The only other day I can get to the pool during the winter is Thursday afternoon when I swim by myself. This is where my question comes in. I want to incorporate some speed work of 25 and 50 meter intervals into my training, but Thursday mornings I do my quality run, which is some kind of hill, track or hard threshold session. And I'm wondering if doing high intensity twice in a day is asking for trouble. Should I A, do both hard workouts and see if I can recover for the weekend? B, just do long, slow distance in the pool on Thursdays? Or C, occasionally sprinkle some short stuff into the swims, but only when I'm feeling fresh? Perhaps you have a different opinion altogether. I would love to hear your thoughts. Up until now, I have been doing option B, swimming 2 to 3 kilometers continuously as my main set. Thanks again." All right, Guy, thank you for the question. So, the crux of this question here, just to summarize, Guy is doing a hard run workout in the morning and has an afternoon swim. And the question is, does it make sense to incorporate intensity in that swim, or should it be an easy endurance-based swim? And generally speaking, my answer is that it's absolutely possible to do 2 intense workouts in a day. And the more important question then if you can do two intense workouts in a day is the overall complexity of the microcycle and how manageable the amount of volume and intensity you do over a period of 7 to 14 days or so is. So for one day, you can absolutely do two intense workouts. Can you do it for a week? Two intense workouts per day? Probably not. Not in a sustainable way anyway. So I don't think that you should be afraid of doing two hard workouts on one single day. Again, it comes back to managing the microcycle. So at a slightly bigger scale than on a daily basis. And it's something that many athletes are doing regularly, of course, both age groupers and professionals. And many coaches actually do like to stack intense workouts, meaning having two intense workouts on one day, and then maybe the following day is just endurance-based with no intense workouts. So that kind of spreads out the intensity or fewer days of the week, even though you might be doing as many intense sessions. But on the other hand, it also gives you those days where you're only doing easy endurance work. So there are two different ways to do that. Both options work, of course. And Joel Filial, for example, is a great example of somebody who talked about not stacking workouts when I interviewed him back in episode 170 something. Personally, I do have a slight preference for stacking workouts like this and then getting some more days that are free from intensity for the athletes that I coach. But for some athletes, we do go the other way of not stacking. So it's all individual, and you'll find out soon enough when you try this. So you need to just go and do it, go and try it and figure out how you react. Since your only option to swim is on that first day and you're swimming twice per week, generally, I would definitely recommend that you include intensity in at least some of your first day swims. Not necessarily all of them. Some can be completely endurance based, even though I wouldn't recommend swimming 2 to 3 kilometers continuously. Even in an endurance swim, I would do something a bit more broken up into various parts, even though you don't have to make it complicated. But the risk with swimming is always that you lose focus when you're swimming just such a long distance straight. So that's why even if you're breaking it up into 30 times 100 with 5 seconds rest, it probably makes for a better quality session, even if all is still endurance based. Either way, the point I was going to make here is that I do think that some of your first day swims need to have should have intensity in them, since you don't have that speed work, as you say, in the group swims that you do either. So speed work is one option, and that could be, as you say, short 25s, maybe 50s, and recoveries would be long. Or the work to rest ratio would be low, so high rest for a little work in terms of duration. But you could also consider, I don't think that it always has to be that sort of speed work. I don't know if that's the way you meant it, because sometimes speed work can be quite an ambiguous term. But I do think that maybe something even more useful would be to do VO2 max type of sessions. So those could be intervals of 50 meters, 100 meters, all the way up to 200 perhaps. And the work to rest ratio would be slightly higher. So for example, a typical example here could be 10 times 100 on 45-second recoveries. That would be a stable VO2 max workout. Best effort. For the pure speed work, just to give another example here, something like 3 sets of 4 times 25 meters all out with 45 to 60 second passive recovery between reps and 5 minutes or more, 5 to 10 minutes of active recovery between sets would be an example. So the goal then for you would be to first try what you can do, like how you react to the swim after having done the hard run in the morning, and then try to optimize for actually being able to do this kind of work, these kinds of workouts regularly in that first day swim. Again, some might be endurance swims on some of your first days, but sometimes you would want to have that intensity, seeing as you're only swimming twice per week, and the other one is fixed. So try to make sure that you do everything around training right, like eating well, hydrating well, sleeping well, and so on. And that will help you recover quicker, especially eating after that run and eating through the day and hydrating through the day will be really important between those workouts to make sure that you bounce back quickly. Another important point is do not sell yourself short. I mentioned it. Don't be afraid of doing 2 intense workouts on a given day. You can most likely do this, but as with anything, it might feel very hard and difficult at first, but the more you get used to it, the better you will become. So just one final point here with the distribution of endurance swimming and harder swimming on those first day runs. So you mentioned that you do some endurance swimming on Mondays, but also threshold swimming. So I don't quite know how much of aerobic endurance swimming you get in that session. So with that being said, it's probably like a fairly moderate amount or actually a small amount, given that threshold sets can be pretty long. So you're probably spending quite a bit of that Monday group swim on the actual threshold stuff that you mentioned that you're doing. So maybe an example template plan would be every other Thursday you focus more on endurance. But then you could also combine that with that very short and sharp speed work that I mentioned, those 25s with long recoveries. And then every other Thursday is a VO2 max set that I mentioned. So for example, the 10 times 100. So you would still be able to get in some endurance in that VO2 max session as well, but slightly less than you would in a speed session where you might not even do 3 of those sets of 4 times 25. You might do 2 times 4 times 25, and that's it basically for speed work. The rest can be spent on endurance. So I hope that this helps, Guy. Good luck with moving up to the long distance. The next question is from Gareth in Houston, Texas, who writes, Dear Michael, great podcast, always incredibly informative. I really enjoyed your conversation with David Bishop. With respect to training twice a day, do you think it might be less stressful for triathletes since we are generally doing 2 different sports and therefore using different muscles that might not be glycogen depleted or fatigued in the second session? Thanks. So that's an interesting question. Thank you for it, by the way. I think that between running and cycling, we are still using our legs, even though, of course, as you know, the individual contribution of various muscle groups is slightly different. But I really don't think in terms of muscle glycogen that it makes too much of a difference. We are still using all of our legs completely, and all our muscles are involved in some way. So I do think that, for example, a morning bike session will cause a similar glycogen depletion in the muscles for an afternoon run as a morning run would do if that morning run / morning bike would be of similar duration and intensity. With swimming, however, I think that it makes sense logically that an hour of hard swimming doesn't use as much glycogen in your leg muscles as an hour of hard running or riding would. I'm not aware if this has been studied at all, so can't really comment on that, but I just think that it makes logical sense, as I think you'll probably agree. But on the other hand, I do feel that except for very, very good swimmers, swimming does impact running and riding from an energy feeling perspective, despite using very different muscles in a similar way as riding and running does. This is purely anecdotal, but it's what it feels like to me. Like when I've done a hard swim in the morning and I go out and do an afternoon run, I feel like I did some hard work, even though I'm using completely different muscles. I feel especially if I haven't fueled well enough, and we're not talking about completely neglecting fueling. We're talking about maybe I wasn't completely on top of that the way I would have needed to be. And then I can immediately feel it, that I feel that sort of, my legs being a bit flat and a bit empty, or that the feeling you get when you are low on glycogen. So this is anecdotal, but it's what it feels like to me and many athletes and coaches I talk to. So, and I don't know why that might be, but personally, I would definitely actually count on there being some level of muscle glycogen depletion even in your non-specific muscle groups from a swim for a run, or the other way around, or for a bike, between biking and swimming as well. Even though it isn't completely clear to me, at least logically or mechanistically, why that might be at this point. But I do think that anecdotally, the way it feels, I do think that there is definitely, even though there are different sports, different muscle groups, at least to some level, it still does happen. But there are some other aspects where I think that twice-a-day workouts may be less stressful for us triathletes compared to single-sport athletes. And the first and obvious one is the stress on tissue. So running for 1 hour and then swimming for 1 hour is obviously going to be less stressful for the running muscles and joints and bone in the lower body compared to doing 2 times 1 hour runs in the same day. This, I think, is the main reason that triathletes can train at so large volumes, because it's just easier to remain healthy when you split 30 hours of training at the elite end or 3 different disciplines than or just one discipline. And even though one of our sports, running, is much more strongly associated with injury than cycling or swimming, I still think that 30 hours of only swimming or only cycling is a lot of one repetitive specific stress that can be very difficult for the body to recover from compared to 30 hours of swimming, biking, and running. And for more on the impact that training load has and the recovery of tissue from training stress, definitely go and listen to episode 209 called Injury Prevention and Rehabilitation with James Debenham. That episode is really, really good for explaining what's going on and how tissue reacts to training stress. But the second reason that training 3 different disciplines might be beneficial for us triathletes is the central nervous system fatigue. So if we're firing each motor pattern less total times compared to our single sport counterparts, then the central fatigue should end up potentially being quite significantly reduced compared with doing the same sport over and over again for a similar total duration. So it's basically a similar argument to the previous one about tissue, but in this case, it is about motor neurons and how the extended use of motor neurons and having them fire very repetitively for long durations each day, that can cause a reduction of motor cortical excitability and central drive, which is what happens when we experience central fatigue. This is a very complex topic, and I don't think that I know enough about it to speak with any super high confidence on whether this theory holds up, that we might experience less central fatigue than other sports. So take it for what it is. It's my personal theory, nothing that I can confirm with any science. But that's another reason why there may be benefits of doing or it may be less stressful for triathletes to do twice-a-day training compared to single sport athletes. On the other hand, I don't think that we should underestimate the cognitive load that doing 3 sports has compared to doing one single sport. So if you think about going out for 2 runs, one in the morning and one in the afternoon, compare that with gearing up for a bike ride and then heading to the pool and all the preparation and things that go into that. I would argue that the difference is huge, and that generally triathlon and multisport has a significantly higher cognitive load than just focusing on one sport. And cognitive load is a massively important aspect of training and adaptation to training that I think is often underestimated. So I would say that perhaps even though we had a couple of cases for why twice-a-day workouts might be less stressful for triathlete, but I'm not sure. I think that this argument for why it might be more stressful kind of evens the score again. So in conclusion, I just want to stress that I have absolutely no data or research to back these different aspects or theories up with. They are my hunches, my guesses only. But I think that in terms of muscle glycogen, that it's pretty much a wash between doing triathlon or doing a single sport. Maybe there are some small positive differences for triathletes, because swimming might not be quite as depleting for running as running or cycling would be. But I actually don't think that they're very big differences. In terms of tissue stress and recovery, I definitely think that there's a big advantage for triathlon. For central fatigue, I think that there is a possible advantage for triathletes, but this is a working theory, nothing that I can speak confidently about. And the cognitive load aspect, I think, likely puts triathletes at a big disadvantage for how stressful twice-a-day workouts is, and just the sport in general. But it's an interesting question and made me think. So thank you very much for sending it in. And then the final question, and I've lost the name of the person asking, but the question is, does weight training on a double workout day have negative effects on training adaptation from the other workout? I usually do my endurance training early in the morning, and on suitable weekdays, I do a 25-minute gym workout during my lunch break. If I do, for example, a high-power, high-cadence bike workout in the morning, and the gym session consists of heavy weights, do these completely different workouts overwrite the adaptations from each other? If so, should weight training be done together with only certain type endurance training or completely isolated? Or do I continue like before? Thanks for the help and awesome podcast. So thanks for the question. I will refer to my own article here, as I think although it's approaching 2 years old by now, it still stands the test of time. It's triathlon strength training in 2018. I'll link to that in the episode description. And when we're doing endurance training and strength training, the research term, the scientific term is concurrent training. And interference between the different modalities, between strength resistance training and endurance training, is present, and to some extent it's always going to be present there. But the extent to which it's present and the interference here refers to how the one modality affects adaptations from the training in the other modality. The extent of that interference depends on a large number of things, and I think it's very important to remember that interference does not mean that most of the effects go to waste. If you're smart about how you structure your training, it probably only means that a very minor detrimental effect of the adaptations to the training modalities involved will be seen, and you will get most of the benefits that you could have had. So that's the goal with planning and structuring your training. So interference between strength and endurance training is maximized when the following conditions are true. 1, you do endurance and strength training in close proximity to each other. 2, the endurance session is of high intensity, 90% or more of VO2 max. 3, the strength training session lies on the high reps or at least mod reps side of the spectrum as opposed to low reps. And 4, the athlete is not used to doing concurrent training. So we can kind of reverse those conditions to, as much as possible, making sure that we avoid interference. So first, the more you do concurrent training, your body will adapt to it and get less sensitive to interference effects, just by you getting used to doing both endurance training and resistance training. And that's important to remember. Second, avoid doing the sessions in close proximity to each other. I do think that the way you do it now, morning and lunch, is perfectly fine. Perhaps even better would be morning and after work in the afternoon, but always remember, done is better than perfect. If lunch works better for you logistically, that's your time window, no problem, go for it. What's often cited in research is an 8-hour window between the sessions will put you very much in the green to avoid interference. But morning and lunch, I would argue, are very, very greenish. So that's perfectly fine. And I can't stress enough that it's better to do it than to not do it. And personally, as an example, I went a year and a half that I always did my gym training right after 90 minutes of hard swimming. And it wasn't ideal by any means, but it was my best alternative logistically. The only way that I could ensure that I got my strength training in with where I was living. And other logistical challenges, etc. So it was definitely worth doing it. I could have had more benefits from the strength training if it had been done in the evening, but I would have been much more likely to skip the session, and it would have been much more stressful, if nothing else, from a cognitive load standpoint, to have to commute again back to the gym. So do keep that in mind. And the third thing that you should do is you can do a hard endurance session before doing your strength and conditioning. But ideally, if you have the option to plan it a little bit, don't go all the way to close to VO2 max as your intensity. Go a bit lower. You can go ride at threshold or run at threshold and that sort of thing, but avoid those really hard 90+% of VO2 max efforts, and that might give you a small benefit for avoiding interference. That being said, I've many times done VO2 max workouts and strength training on the same day. I prescribed it as well. Sometimes that's the only way to fit everything in, and I don't think that it has a huge impact necessarily. I think that the more important one is that once you've done it for a few weeks and you have gotten your adaptation to concurrent training, as mentioned in the first point, at that point it starts to make less and less of a difference what type of training you're doing for your endurance session. And finally, fourth, for the strength resistance training, go for mostly choosing a high weight, low rep training strategy. And this is not just for avoiding interference. It's actually mostly because, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, it's mostly because that's the kind of strength training that has been shown to generate performance improvements in endurance athletes, in particular through improved exercise economy. So it does work out perfectly. It's the kind of strength training that you should be doing to improve as an endurance athlete, but it's also the kind of strength training that minimizes interference with endurance training. So to sum up, by no means does concurrent training completely overwrite the adaptations of the work done, and it's nowhere near it, in fact. But there is some interference present. There will be, always will be, and it does make sense to try to minimize it, first and foremost, by trying to separate the workouts with a large enough time window. But secondly, kind of also thinking about what kind of endurance training and strength training you are doing on that double workout day. But importantly, keep in mind that your body will become less and less sensitive to interference the more you do concurrent training. So I hope that this helps, and that's it for today's episode. I'll link in the episode description to the other episodes and articles mentioned, so you can check them out. Keep sending in questions for future Q&A episodes to michael@scientifictriathlon.com, and that's Michael with a K. And if you are interested in the coaching, training plans, and the other products and services we offer on scientifictriathlon.com, check out our website, scientifictriathlon.com. Big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. If you haven't already, do try out their free hydration plan. That's a series of questions, a simple quiz that you can answer in a few minutes, and it will give you a good estimate for how much sodium you lose in your sweat and how much you sweat, and based on that, it will calculate your hydration and electrolyte needs for your goal race. You can get 15% off their products with the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15. And big thanks to Roka for sponsoring the podcast. Go to roka.com/TTS to get your 20% discount off their wetsuits, tri-suits, swim skins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear and prescription glasses, and get your equipment in order for the new season. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.